So welcome everybody who is just starting to tune in. My name is Maria Coleman. I'm the Director of Development at the Seward House. I'm joined tonight by our Director of Education, Jeff Ludwig, and the author of our October Seward Book Club pick, Amy Greenberg, author of Lady First. So we are going to do a little bit of an intro and then we'll get right into it.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks to everyone at home or work or wherever making the time to join us. I hope that you, like me, have spent the better part of the month enjoying Lady First. I know I've learned an awful lot, not just about First Lady Sarah Polk, but about 19th century American history, and there are a few better qualified to educate us about that time period than Professor Amy Greenberg, Professor of History and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This book came out last year, but she'd previously written a book on That Wicked War about Polk, Clay, and Lincoln. I can't wait to talk to her about that book, the Polk legacy in general, for as long as we can keep her with us tonight. But I know many of you were as interested as I was in learning through the lens of Sarah Polk about how women found ways into political power, sometimes unorthodox, some ways unexpected, as I think Professor Greenberg nicely captures. So many of us have been conditioned to think about 1848 as a year of Seneca Falls, and the history written by leaders of the women's rights movement of particular stripe and persuasion. But there's a whole array of history to be unpacked, and the story of Sarah Polk is a great way to begin to uncover that. So we're just delighted to have Amy joining us from Penn State tonight and to discuss her book. And Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm so pleased to be here at the Seward House, but really just in Pennsylvania. I'm happy that all of you are here, and this is great. I'm glad to be speaking today, and I hope that you will enjoy this discussion about this amazing woman, Sarah Polk, with me. So those of you who didn't read the book, Sarah Polk was the wife of James K. Polk, and here Sarah and James are. And she was a very important and powerful First Lady. And before I wrote my book, there had been no academic or intellectual full-length biography of this woman ever written. The reason that I undertook this project is, as Jeff mentioned, I wrote a book about the US-Mexico War, and James K. Polk was the president who oversaw that war. And in the course of researching Polk and his Democratic administration's ideas about manifest destiny and the way that they prosecuted the war, I kept coming across references to Mrs. Polk, as in politicians saying, oh, Mrs. Polk thinks, or met with Mrs. Polk, or the president and Mrs. Polk were in fine form. But just all of these comments about this woman who never appears on lists of important first ladies or well-known first ladies. I knew almost nothing about her, and when I tried to research her for the purposes of writing my book, like I mentioned, like there was no biography of her. So I thought, well, let's see what I can do with Mrs. Polk. Here's a woman who was very conservative in a time period when the women that were powerful and we know about were not conservative. James K. Polk was president in 1848, the same time that the Seneca Falls meeting happened. But Sarah Polk was not a fan of women's rights, not a supporter of really anything that you could consider reform. Instead, she was a very religious Presbyterian woman who was utterly committed to the Democratic Party's policies of territorial expansion with slavery and the idea of hierarchy. So one of the things that really attracted me to Sarah Polk as a biographical subject, although not necessarily as like somebody I would want to hang out with, is the fact that she was this remarkably powerful political woman, treated as an equal by powerful political men, while not herself claiming to have any rights or any, not claiming any particular power for women generally. So that's kind of the background of Sarah Polk. Now let me tell you a little bit about her and her rise to power. Here's the earliest known portrait of Sarah, taken when she was about 21 or 22. So in addition to all the other things that are surprising about a woman who in the 1820s to 1840s became incredibly powerful in Washington, D.C., there's the fact that Sarah Polk grew up on the frontier in Tennessee. So this is not somebody who went to Emma Willard School. It's not somebody from the Northeast who you would think would grow up in a kind of intellectual household. Sarah was the daughter of a slave owner and a land speculator named Joel Childress, who was very kind of connected to local Tennessee politics. And she absolutely grew up on the frontier. Now, the thing that, if you want to talk about how Sarah Polk went from being a kind of ordinary girl growing up on the Tennessee frontier to the most powerful woman in America, which is what I believe her to be, and I think I make the argument that she was in the 1840s the most powerful woman in America. There's a few things that you have to know. And one of the things that I found really fascinating about Sarah, and definitely I think helped shape her character, is the fact that her father believed that she should be well educated and treated her as an equal. So he sent Sarah and her sister over the mountains all the way to North Carolina to go to the finest school open to women in the entire region, which was the Salem Women's Academy. And she got a very fine education there. So she was extremely well educated. Her father was very rich. And like I mentioned before, they were very interested in local Democratic politics. Now, not far from where Sarah grew up in Tennessee, another individual grew up, and that was James K. Polk. They met each other and married. And then they started on a relationship that was nothing like the ideal of a marriage in the time period. And I'm showing you this picture here because this is an image. Really, you could find any number of images like this. It's an image that's supposed to show what a family, the ideal family was like in the early 19th century. So this is an image of a kind of domestic bliss. And in this picture, as you can see, the mother is in charge of love and the household and children, and the father is the intellectual one. So there's a division, many of you I'm sure know about the idea of separate spheres. This is the ideal that Sarah is born into, and that basically all middle and upper class women are born into this time period. And it is an image which reforming women will fight against to a certain extent. Conservative women will not. But Sarah is very unique in that she utterly breaks free from this mold because of her marriage to James K. Polk. Now, how did Sarah break free from the mold of the domestic marriage where the husband was in charge of the intellect and the wife was in charge of the family? Well, the way that she did that is that she married a man who was incapable of fathering children. So James had experimental bladder surgery as a teenager that left him unable to have children. So he and Sarah remained childless. And rather than stay home and take care of kids in Tennessee, Sarah went to Washington, D.C. with him when he was elected to Congress. And she fell in love with Washington, D.C. They lived in a boarding house. Boarding houses were a kind of common place where congressmen lived in the time period when they were in Washington, D.C. Not a lot of women lived there because they were very inappropriate for children, but Sarah didn't have children. So she moved into a boarding house just like this one in D.C. and became a real political mover and shaker on the side besides her husband. James, oh, here's a picture, by the way, of what Washington, D.C. looked like when James and Sarah first moved there in the 1820s. Really pretty much a village, very small, political class, and there was a lot of room for a intelligent, politically interested woman to make a difference in Washington, D.C. And this is what Sarah ends up doing. So James, he gets to Washington, D.C. pretty much exactly at the right time to rise to power on the coattails of his mentor, Andrew Jackson. And when Andrew Jackson's president, James is made Speaker of the House of Representatives. And Sarah, as his wife, becomes central to his ability to exercise political power. And the way that she does this is that she turns her rooms in the boarding house into what contemporaries described as a political salon. So she would hold many events where she would invite politicians to come to these events, and she would talk to them very knowledgeably about politics, and she was extremely well read. And she would work as a kind of satellite of James and his beliefs in this seemingly domestic position of being a hostess of these parties. But eventually her power expanded beyond that. And she ended up meeting with all politicians outside of these events on James' behalf and taking over for him most of the roles that would ordinarily be given to a personal secretary. She became his communications director during campaigns. And she just gradually became more and more powerful as a political wife in the 1820s and the 1830s and into the 1840s alongside James K. Polk. Now, the story of how this happens is part of what I chart in the book. And like Jeff said, to a certain extent, this is really the story of how women could exercise power in a period when they had no right to vote. They could not own property in their own names once they were married. And they were all assumed to be deferential and subservient to their husbands. But Sarah was remarkable in that she learned how to kind of mobilize this idea of deference, use it as a pose. One thing that people always noted about Sarah is that she never expressed her own opinions about things. She always would say, well, Mr. Polk thinks, and then would express an opinion about a political issue. And she just represented herself as a conduit to the president. And in fact, she was. Now, another reason why Sarah ended up becoming this incredibly powerful woman, first of all, I told you about her education and her father treating her like an equal. The second really major point here is that James also treated her as a political equal. And beyond that, I think he pushed her into politics. I'm not saying she didn't want to become a political figure. She clearly enjoyed it. But he was an extremely suspicious individual. He didn't trust people easily. And Sarah was one of the few people that he trusted. So he constantly asked her to do things that he wouldn't trust other people to do. He also believed that her job should be to help him at his job, and his job was politics. So here we have a portrait of Sarah kind of at the height of her powers. And this painting would have been done around the time that she became First Lady after James was elected president in 1844. This, however, is my favorite image of Sarah Polk. And it is a print created by Nathaniel Currier. And it represents her as First Lady. And it's titled Mrs. James K. Polk, or J.K. Polk, which was the name she preferred for herself. She liked to be called Mrs. Polk rather than Sarah. She really embraced this idea that she was a wife, but she interpreted what it meant to be a wife kind of unusually. And so here's why I love this image. So this is not really an image of a pretty or an attractive or a decorative woman, right? She is a solid presence. She's very serious looking, and she kind of exudes an air of being someone you can trust, I think. She seems like a trustworthy, strong and capable individual, which in fact is what she was. One thing that is inappropriate about this image, though, I think, is she kind of looks big here. She was actually an incredibly tiny person. She wore a size 3 shoe and she was very small. But I think it helps for the idea of this picture that here's somebody very substantial as First Lady. I think they captured that about her. Now, when James got elected to the presidency and Sarah was First Lady, she was incredibly popular. Like, the public loved her. But the public didn't really know who she was. And that is in large part because she was very good at manipulating the press. Here's what the public thought they knew about Sarah Polk. They knew that she was really religious, and she was very religious. She did not drink. She did not believe in dancing. She didn't believe in gambling. She was a Sabbatarian, so she didn't think you should do anything except go to church on Sunday. And she really lived by these rules. To the extent that if a politician approached James on a Sunday, she would go into the room and she would insist that the other man go to church with them. Now, what's interesting about this is that James himself is actually not very religious. He goes to church with Sarah, but he actually is not baptized into a church until the end of his life. Sarah, on the other hand, is this extremely religious old school Presbyterian. And the public loves that about her because then, as now, there is a division in the country between what many people in America think of as a kind of East Coast elite. And then there's ordinary, real salt of the earth people. And Sarah represented herself as one of these real salt of the earth people, somebody from Tennessee, somebody who was very religious, who wasn't interested in frivolity. In point of fact, as I already mentioned, she's incredibly well educated. She was very wealthy growing up. She continued to be wealthy, but she really downplays this. So she dresses very conservatively. She doesn't wear any gems. And in contrast to some of the first ladies who came before her, who were seen as maybe not humble and religious enough, Sarah really plays this up. So she represents herself as this very humble, relatable, frugal, hardworking wife. And most people in America don't understand is that, in fact, she is meeting with politicians privately to advance Polk's legislation. She is communicating with numerous men about political issues, and then conveying all this information to her husband. Now, just a couple things I want to say here about Sarah Polk. One thing that I found really fascinating in doing my research was the way in which she used parties to promote the US-Mexican War when Polk was president. She made sure to always have veterans, preferably wounded veterans, at these parties she would hold, and would give speeches about the importance of upholding the country first in order to make people like the US-Mexico War. Here's a wonderful photo taken. James K. Polk was the first president who was photographed in the White House because daguerreotypes were just invented a few years before Polk's presidency. Sarah thought they were great, so she had a daguerreotypist come in and take a bunch of photos. And you can see we have Sarah and James here, and then various other luminaries. Here's James Buchanan. Here's Dolly Madison. Oh no, here's Dolly. Dolly was a good friend of Sarah's. Cave Johnson, looking kind of like a skeleton here. And this young lady here was one of Sarah's nieces. Sarah was able to devote most of James's presidency to the actual work of politics because she made the nieces that would come and stay with her do the work that was usually take up most of the time of political wives. So she made her nieces return calls to other women, and she just basically focused on what was considered men's business. And while James was president, the United States went from looking like this at the beginning of the presidency to basically this. And that was thanks to the US-Mexican War, which she helped promote, as well as the division of the Oregon country during James's presidency. So James's presidency was remarkable for many reasons, but primarily because of the way in which, under his leadership, the United States expanded in territory so greatly. Now, you may recognize some of these women. I already mentioned these are some of the women who we think of when we think about powerful women from the 1840s. Those are the Seneca Falls women's rights activists. And like I mentioned, Sarah was not just not involved in women's rights, she actually openly opposed the idea that women should have power, which is hypocritical because she herself was very powerful. But I think I talk about in the book the way in which there was a class of women who, because of their money and their political connections, had a huge amount of political power before women had the right to vote. And I think they didn't see any reason in extending that to other women. Now, half of the book is about Sarah's rise to power. It's about her youth, and it's about meeting James, and it's about the incredible political and romantic relationship they forged together, and how she helped him be powerful in Washington, DC, and in Tennessee, and finally as president. But many of you probably know, James was not only the youngest person to become president, but he became president. He was also the youngest person to die after leaving office. He only survived 3 months after leaving office. He died of cholera. And he was eventually buried in this crypt you can see here in front of the mansion that he and Sarah intended to live the rest of their lives in Nashville, Tennessee, called Polk Place. So Sarah spends half of her life as a widow, over 40 years, living in Polk Place, preserving the memory of James. And when I started the project, I thought, well, you know, what happens after James dies isn't going to be very interesting because her political power was really connected to her husband. I mean, that's what she always said. But what I found in researching this book is that Sarah had a totally fascinating life after James died. We just didn't know about it previously. She rides out the Civil War by manipulating Union and Confederate generals. She secretly helps the Confederacy, but she claims to be neutral. She claims Polk Place is neutral. She manages a incredibly deadly cotton plantation in Mississippi that has a much higher mortality rate than even the norm for what is the most brutal form of slavery in the United States in the 1850s. She manages that on her own. After the end of the Civil War, she becomes, I don't want to say a mother, but she ends up taking care of this little girl who you see here named Sally. I won't go into how she ends up getting control of this little girl, but the little girl ends up meaning a lot to her in her life. And what is weird about this is that James and Sarah were the only presidential couple who never had children. Either they never had children of their own, which is true of a number of couples, but they also never adopted children. So they were so happy as a party of two that they even refused to adopt children when other siblings asked them to. They just didn't want children. And then, at age 49, she gets a little girl, and that little girl ends up becoming her companion. Now, I know that I'm pretty much out of time, and there are many things to talk about. After the Civil War, Sarah ends up taking the lead at promoting Confederate cemeteries and ends up having this really remarkable role in influencing the Confederate monument movement, which of course has caused us so much trouble since then. Here's a picture of the women's Christian Temperance League. And Sarah ends up inspiring this group of women because, of course, she had been a teetotaler in the White House. They are inspired by her. And then ultimately, the Daughters of the Confederacy are inspired by her as well. So these last kind of final points, her connection to the Temperance League, which of course is discredited after Prohibition proves what a mockery the idea of getting rid of alcohol is. And then the Daughters of the Confederacy, her connections to these things end up really kind of leading the way or making it possible to forget that at one time she was such a powerful woman. So what I'm trying to do in this book is not just shed light on a really interesting period in American history and women's rights, but also kind of introduce you to a really complicated character that shows how some of our narratives about who has political power and who doesn't, and what a powerful woman looks like in this time period, kind of shows what the limitations are of those views. So I hope if you read the book that you enjoyed it, and that if you didn't read the book that you will read the book, and that you learn about a lot of the other fascinating things that she does in her life. I've only touched on a few of them. And also you'll get to read about her relationship with James, which is like really one of the most remarkably close relationships of any married presidential couple in American history. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was incredible and fascinating. I really have enjoyed spending so much time with the book. As we were talking a bit before we started live streaming, I was struck by so many parallels and just the basic biographies of William and Frances Seward and Sarah and James Polk. They're all born around the same time. William Seward's 1801, Frances is 1805, so sort of splitting right between Sarah's age. The stories of their education and meeting as a result of these educations. A young boy, James, would have met a young girl, Sarah, for the first time, and it's through Frances's education at the Emma Willard School or Troy Seminary that she's introduced to William, and they're just teenagers. Both couples get married in 1824, and it's pretty much a direct path to politics, though they're ostensibly lawyers. For Polk, it's right away to Washington in this boarding house and the salon life. And then the governor of Tennessee, they both get married in 1824. Seward starts off with a New York State Senate position. They become governor around the same time. And I found fascinating the way you described the difficulty and the immensity of running for governor, which is unlike any other office, maybe the hardest job to win. Seward runs 3 times, Polk runs 3 times. There's mixed success for each. And this notion of a companionate marriage that you described so well. And if we had more time to spend together, I try to tell you about how, for William and Frances, it was very much the same thing. A different political side of the aisle, Whigs and Republicans, but Seward greatly valued and respected his wife's intellect and political acumen. She had license to be quite critical to him in letters, and often was, taking him to task when she felt he wasn't sufficiently anti-slavery, and when you get close to compromising. So, and then of course the style of Sarah's empowerment of her, but her husband was exactly what William Seward hoped Frances would do for him, to be the one who would be planning these dinner parties and balls and salons. And Frances was occasionally willing to be in the withdrawing room, angling with women in New York, say for property rights, but not crossing over like Sarah does to the parlor. So for anybody who's watching this, who's a friend of the Seward House Museum, you really do need to read this book, and you'll be blown away. I know that. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you. So this is so great. I just have to jump in here. So this companionate marriage that the Sewards have, in a way, that's not a surprise, because New England and New York Whigs that are educated, they are the people who are most likely to believe that women are equals to their husband, right? That they are companions to their husband. Whereas the Polks come from a totally different place and tradition. Like, they are coming out of frontier Tennessee, and they are Democrats. And this, I've spent a really long time thinking and writing about the relationship between gender and the political parties in this time period. And what anybody will tell you is that the Democrats actually in this time period, they make hay out of the idea of patriarchy, right? They say, oh, the Whigs, you know, they're kowtowing to women, but we Democrats, we are in charge of our families, right? Like that we are in charge of our children, we are the patriarchs. The Whigs, on the other hand, even in their campaign events, they give a special place to women in their parades. Women are hugely important in mobilizing, in campaigns, in basically canvassing for husbands for the Whigs. And in fact, there are a couple of authors who wrote a wonderful article, Ron and Mary Zabore are their names, which is called All the Women Are Whigs. And basically it was about the idea that in the 1840s, all women were Whigs. And that's because the Whigs valued women. But what I realized writing this paper or writing this book was that in fact, there were a ton of women who were Democrats. And by that, I mean, they were completely politically connected. And I know this because they wrote to Sarah Polk. The difference is that the Democratic Party just wasn't that interested in having these people be public representatives for the party. So they were fine with women working behind the scenes, but women should basically not be out, not be speaking in public. But there were definitely extremely politically connected and passionate Democratic women. And that I honestly didn't know that before I started writing this. So in a way, the Sewards made so much more sense to me when I started this project than the Polks did.
We have a couple questions coming in through Facebook, and the first one kind of connects to what you were just saying. So part comment, part question. I'll read the whole thing. It may be because of the lack of letters by Sarah Polk, but she did not appear to be a warm person. I expected to hear about her worries about her husband's health, especially when he fell ill during his presidency and afterward when he had cholera. And her niece asking if Sarah loved her when Sarah was at the end of her life seemed to confirm this. Do you think that she was compassionate, an empathetic person, or was she somewhat detached from emotional involvement?
Oh my gosh, no, I think, well, thank you for bringing up that there's very, very few letters from Sarah. She, I don't think was a big letter writer, and almost everything's been lost. Like I put together an archive of all of the letters to and from her, and there really weren't very many. And those letters that we do have, a lot of times, though some of the best letters, she's really kind of cranky, but there is no question that she was an extremely affectionate person to the people that she cared about. And that isn't just James, although James above all other people, but also a sister-in-law, one of her brothers, all of these nieces worshiped her. Her kind of adopted daughter, Sally, they all talked about her as a warm person. So it just doesn't come through in the writings. And I think, but definitely she was. And you can see it. So when you read some of the correspondence between her and James, it's weird correspondence because they are both so political, but I think if you read it closely, you can see real underlying affection there.
And another question says, while I understand the attraction of Mrs. Polk, she seems to me as a controversial figure, not really taking a stand for one side or the other. Am I incorrect, or does she just seem to go with the way the wind blows and use that to her advantage?
I think she's actually really conservative. It was hard, I'm not going to lie, it was hard to write this book. Like I would have been much happier writing about Frances Seward. The stuff that Sarah believed in, a lot of it was, it doesn't work for us now. And it didn't even probably work for most people. She was a true believer in slavery. She believed that Mexican people were not deserving of their own land. she stated publicly that it didn't really matter if something was right, if it was good for the country. So I don't know that if she goes with the way the wind blows so much as she is really, really deeply conservative. I mean, she's really invested in views that have been so thoroughly discredited. She's not really one of the people that is a sympathetic person in terms of her political views, so that made it challenging to write about. I mean, when she was running her plantation, she sold husbands away from wives. She worked the people that she owned in order to get the maximum profit from them. She was a problem. Now, the one time when she does play both sides is during the Civil War, and I think that is just kind of a sign of her political genius, is that she's able to navigate an insanely difficult situation. So she is a widow from Tennessee, a clear Southern sympathizer with family members who are fighting for the Confederacy. And she's the widow of James K. Polk. And Nashville so Tennessee is the last state to leave the Confederacy and pretty much the first state to be captured again. So Nashville is like in Union hands almost the entirety of the Civil War. And she's got a really difficult role to play, and she just plays it brilliantly by claiming that she's neutral. But everybody knows she's not neutral. Even like Ulysses S. Grant knows she's not neutral. But there's not really anything that these generals can do about it because they want Mrs. Polk on their side. Like, they need to have this very beloved, esteemed widow. They don't want her actively opposing the Union Army because it would not help the Union cause.
And we have one more question from Facebook right now, and then Jeff can probably sneak in with one of his questions while other people type. But last one for me right now. While she was First Lady, did she ever help any members of the public? She seemed to get a lot of letters asking for help, but I didn't hear of her actually helping anyone other than friends and relatives.
Oh my gosh, great question. Okay, let me tell you about one group of women that she helped. She helped the Mormon women after the Mormons were kicked out of Illinois. So if you know anything about the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they are persecuted and they're basically forced from place to place. And right before the US-Mexico War starts, there's basically a war against Mormons in Illinois, and they basically have to flee the state, and they're really, really destitute. I mean, people are starving to death, and this is after Joseph Smith has been murdered. And I was shocked to find that Sarah led this aid movement to get money for the Mormons. I mean, I thought in a way, it wasn't surprising because James K. Polk was extremely ecumenical when it came to helping people of different religions. So whereas the Whigs had very strong feelings about what was good religion and bad religion, the Democrats were more open to the idea of religious pluralism. And so James appointed Catholic priests to go down to Mexico, and he, he at least, gave lip service to this idea that the United States is like basically a country for people of all religions. So it isn't a surprise that Sarah followed up with that, except that I know personally how incredibly religious she was, and that Protestantism in general really didn't have any use for members of this new upstart religion, which most mainstream Protestants thought were not legitimate at all. So that's one group that she did help.
Along those same lines, Amy, I was wondering, there was a line in the book where I think it's a Polk speech where he's trying to welcome Americans, native and adopted, to this country, trying to claim this sort of Jacksonian mantle. of empowering the common man, and she tries to be the first lady for the ordinary salt of the earth common American. And I was interested too to read that part about their support for the Mormons, and some sympathy for Catholics. Obviously, from the point of view of the Seward House, it was a wedge issue for the Whig Party, and know nothings and anti-immigration sentiment. And Seward's a pro-immigrant governor, but it gets him into a lot of trouble, and the party fractures over it. Is it equally true that the Polks, maybe if we're looking for ways that we can look at their politics and find other aspects that maybe are easier to stomach, are they pro-immigration?
No, I wouldn't say they're pro-immigration. I would say that they're not anti-immigration. That would be the difference that I would draw. I mean, of course, all of these politicians are trying to get the votes of immigrants. And for a while, especially after the rise of the real nativist movement, starting in the 1840s, the Democrats do very well in telling immigrants that, you know what, the Whigs hate you and the Know Nothing Party hates you, and we don't. We're totally fine with whatever you want to do. I mean, that works for the Democrats. That said, I wouldn't say that they're pro-immigrant. I haven't read anything from James or Sarah saying anything like, we need more immigrants. Just like, we're not going to discriminate against you.
That makes sense. There was just that one line, I think it came right before the mention of the Mormons. Another question I had, Andrew Jackson shows up time and time again, which I suppose should not be a surprise in a book that takes place in the Middle Tennessee frontier. And I spent a lot of time Googling how far is it from the Hermitage to Polk Place and to Polk House in Columbia, and where is Murfreesboro? From the first time we hear of Jackson and branding Sarah's father's hands when he's a judge, all the way through his post-presidency in support of Polk, I kept waiting for sort of a long description of the two of them, what Jackson meant to Sarah and how he really viewed her. And we get bits and pieces of it. She seems to have survived the Peggy Eaton scandal. Do you have a sense of how those two felt about each other?
You know what? That's great. I mean, I think when I originally thought about this book, I did imagine an extended passage on Sarah and she called him Uncle Andrew, right? So this is how, okay, so here's what you need to know. The Polks and the Childresses, Sarah's maiden name is Childress, they go way back. When Andrew Jackson goes down to New Orleans before the Battle of New Orleans, he is wearing an incredibly expensive uniform that Joel Childress, Sarah's father's, bought for him. They're both totally big players in Tennessee politics. And Sarah knows Andrew Jackson from her, when she's really little, she gets to know him. She spends quite a bit of time around Andrew Jackson and she calls him Uncle Andrew. So there is a story that I was unable to verify that Andrew Jackson is the person who told James K. Polk to marry Sarah Childress, that he basically said, you should marry Joel Childress's daughter. But yeah, they both are so close to Jackson. He helps her out many times politically. And one of my favorite details about this is that, so I don't think I fully explained, but James K. Polk was really a terrible conversationalist. Like, people didn't really enjoy hanging out with him. He had no sense of humor and he wasn't fun, but Sarah was a lot of fun and she was a great conversationalist. And so when Andrew Jackson would write James letters, when James and Sarah were living in Tennessee, when he was governor and trying to become governor, Jackson would write, bring Mrs. Polk with you. Like, he would just say, like, please bring, and he always spelled Polk, P-O-K-E, bring Mrs. Polk with you, or say hello to Mrs. Polk. I hope please tell Mrs. Polk she needs to come with you when you come visit. So there's this image of, like, Andrew Jackson just wants Sarah to be there just for kind of the, amusement. The best story about Sarah and Jackson is that Andrew Jackson, when he left the presidency and went back to Tennessee after the end of his second term, James and Sarah traveled in the carriage with them. And supposedly he said to her, she claimed this was true, He turned to Sarah and he said, you know, you will return to Washington, D.C., and the crown will be on your head. Not on James's head, but on your head. That's how she remembered it anyhow. So yeah, very good, very tight relationship. And Sarah, I make the argument in the book, in a way, she tries to model herself as a female Andrew Jackson, like representing the common man. This kind of, her attitudes, her views are all directly taken from Andrew Jackson.
Okay, I have another question from Facebook. This is kind of a follow-up to the other one about her helping people outside of her friends and relative circle. So this lady mentions remembering one letter she received from a woman whose husband had lost his job as a postmaster. Can you expand on that a little bit more, and just the idea of her helping these other people?
Okay, so first of all, the person who asked that question, thank you so much for remembering that letter. It was the wife of a postmaster in the state of Pennsylvania. And, you know, the letter, which I quote at length in the book because I was so absolutely blown away by this letter. This woman, she has a big family and they are really, really poor. And her husband really needs the job as postmaster. This is a time period when presidents had a remarkable amount of power to give jobs to people out as spoils. And so many people write Sarah and they want jobs. And I couldn't even begin to talk about all the letters asking Sarah for jobs. Now, as the person posting on Facebook is kind of noting, we don't have a lot of evidence that she did very much for people unless she was related to them or they were friends of hers or friends of friends. And I have absolutely no evidence one way or the other that she helped out financially any of these people that wrote her. Now, that doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but I think it probably didn't. I think everybody who becomes a president or is close to a president is receiving so many letters asking for help. But I did quote that letter in detail because the author was so eloquent and her life was so different from Sarah's. She had all of these children and she was so poor. And she said in the letter, my husband has always been a good Democrat. And there are other men who want the position as postmaster and they do not have large families and they have money. And we have a huge family and we have no money. And this is why we need it. And she explicitly says, as a woman, I hope you will understand why I am writing you, because I have to deal with all of these financial claims and it is so difficult. And so that one really got to me. But yeah, no, my guess is that she didn't help these people. And in a way, it would have been a surprise if she had.
Amy, I had a question forming in my mind from the early chapters of this book where you begin with the chalkboards and the globes and Sarah's education. And I started making these connections right away to Frances. And you've already done a really nice job explaining, you know, what a different book that would have been and how maybe uncommon Frances is after all. But I was thinking about how it's part of this remarkable first-rate education that Frances receives from early on, where she begins to question assumed truths and she begins to form critical anti-slavery opinions and that reformer pedigree. And it's all part of sort of the awakening and the opening of the mind that happens for her. And I'm sure being educated for Sarah Polk in Tennessee was a vastly different enterprise with different books and different emphases. But from that point on, I was really interested in the way that she justified to herself, especially when she's championing to be this advocate for direct democracy, which is what Jacksonian, the democracy was supposed to be about. How did she sort of reconcile or square what I saw as a contradiction? I'm sure she didn't see it as a contradiction, but being an advocate for democracy.
This is such a great question. Okay, so here's the first thing I have to say about this. Implicit in Jeff's question is the idea that the Emma Willard curriculum was superior to the curriculum at the Salem Women's Academy. And it wasn't. It was the same curriculum. And these curricula are like, they're remarkable. They are almost identical to the curriculum that men are getting in colleges, with the exception of the fact that men are studying classical languages and women have embroidery and music to deal with instead. And in both cases, you can actually argue, well, learning classical languages is really not that different from learning embroidery and piano, because in both cases, these are really just ways to show off that you're educated. No one really needs to know Greek or Latin. It's a way to basically show your education. So Sarah has an amazing education, but she doesn't question anything. If anything, I'd say she doubles down on the received wisdom. And I attribute that to the fact that she is so Presbyterian. So in a time period when people like the Sewards, and in fact, most people in America, are experiencing the Second Great Awakening and religious movements that are trying to impress on everybody that salvation is within the individual's ability to achieve, and that God is not hierarchical. God loves everybody. This kind of like this evangelical movement and an idea utterly escapes old school Presbyterianism, which is what Sarah is raised in, and in fact what James K. Polk is raised in too. So you have this strata of people, but this is particularly true in the backcountry in Tennessee and North Carolina, where the Second Great Awakening isn't affecting them at all. And instead what they are living with is a religious reality where hierarchy of men above women and white above Black appears to be God's will. And Sarah never questions that. At one point, she's in the White House with James, and she looks outside and she sees enslaved laborers working on the grounds. And she says to James, well, God made it this way. Like, they didn't choose their place and we didn't choose our place. God made it this way. And James thinks that's hilarious. So he just says, oh, Sarah, don't be silly. But this is her deeply held religious belief. What is so remarkable is that she doesn't let that stop her from doing what she needs to do. So it's true of everybody else, but it isn't true of her.
I have another question from Facebook talking about James and Sarah's relationship. So Mary says, did James Polk talk about Sarah in his diaries, or did he write knowing that they would be read by others as historical documents?
Oh my golly, if any of you want to read something really weird, I recommend reading James K. Polk's diaries. I mean, they're so weird. I teach at Penn State, and I often teach a kind of undergraduate senior seminar on the US-Mexico War. And there's always like one student that I'll say, why didn't you write your paper on James K. Polk's diaries? Like, read them. So first of all, here's the things in the diaries. He does write about Sarah. He refers to her as Mrs. Polk the whole time. He never calls her Sarah. He says, Mrs. Polk, was taken ill today, or Mrs. Polk went and did this, that, or that, or, I came out of the room and Mrs. Polk was meeting with Senator so-and-so in the blue room. So detached, absolutely no affection is evidenced. He clearly was writing it for posterity, but even beyond that, he's so, I don't even know. I wish I could come up with a better word than weird, but they're so detached and clinical. His descriptions of everything are so clinical. And so you cannot get a sense of his relationship with her from the diaries. You have to look at the few letters that there are, and then also people that knew them who talked about them. But, at one point, Sarah left to go to New York to go shopping to try and buy furniture for this fabulous new house that they were building in Nashville, Polk Place. And James he misses her so much. He writes her over and over again, and he's just worried about, oh, I haven't heard from you, and are you okay? And I'm so bored. And he's so dependent on her. So you can see it there, but no, you cannot read James K. Polk's diaries and expect to learn anything about their relationship.
Well, Amy, I think there's time for maybe one more question. If nobody on Facebook has one, Maria, are we clear on Facebook? Maybe I'll ask it. And I was reading the last chapter of your book and thinking about this long period of her as a widow, and then taking in Sally, and then Sally's daughter Sadie, and finding joy in doing that. I was wondering, do you think there's any evidence of her changing her mind on any of her positions, or is it more of the same when she's speaking about how good it is to see independent women becoming teachers, or joining with a very conservative Frances Willard and the Temperance Christian Union, and an organization that will be advocating suffrage, which certainly would have been unthinkable to Sarah 40 years, 50 years earlier. The judge in Pennsylvania who sent her tracts on property rights legislation. Do you fold that into Sarah's conservatism changing with the times, or is there evidence that maybe she was rethinking some of her positions?
I think she was definitely rethinking her positions. And again, when her views change they're after the part of the story that anybody knows about. Like, to the extent that anyone knew about Sarah Polk, they knew about her during James's presidency. And then he dies in 1849. He's dead. So what happens to Sarah after that? I do think her views change. You can see that in some of the newspaper interviews that she gives later in her life. She talks to journalists about how many more opportunities there are for women and how there weren't those opportunities before. Her views about single women definitely change, and her views about women who have jobs change. So by no means does she become a liberal exemplar, but she definitely, she clearly relishes the opportunity to interact with women who are in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And I just want to say, like, in retrospect, the Women's Christian Temperance Union the idea of nobody being able to drink was not a great idea. That didn't work out too well for them, but they were pretty remarkably liberal at the time. And by liberal, I mean activists. Like, they were radicals to a certain degree. And Sarah did not turn away from that. Like, they wanted to end pornography. They wanted to end sexual abuse for women. And, these were all the kind of radical moves for the time. She never got behind suffrage. That was one that was too far for her. But yeah, she did. She becomes a kind of much more interesting person later in her life. And that really surprised me.
Amy, thank you so much for spending the hour with us and for this great book. I hope we'll be able to invite you to Auburn, or if you're coming back to Rochester for a Seward Papers talk, we can all bring our copies to meet you there and get them autographed and get to meet you in person.
I would love that. Bring the books, and you can say, oh, I saw you on Facebook, and I'll sign them, and we can talk about, remember that back then with COVID.
Anybody who didn't.
It's over now, right? That will come someday. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you, Maria. This has been a real pleasure, and thank you, everybody watching.
And for everybody watching, if you haven't read the book, please do, but maybe not yet, because we have our next book talk happening next month, November 19th. We're welcoming Professor Joseph Fry, Emeritus at University of Nevada at Las Vegas, who has a new 2019 book out called Lincoln Seward. We'll get more into Seward Lincoln, their relationship, and especially as that played out in 4 years of Civil War foreign policy. We hope you'll join us for that. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.